support them. Now, our next expert is Madam al-Khawaja from the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and you will speak on the situation in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone who made it here today. I'm going to start by quickly speaking about the Gulf in general, as I also work as the head of International Office for the Gulf Center for Human Rights. For too long, unfortunately, the Western communities and the Western governments have looked at the GCC in the form of monarchies rather than populations. Unfortunately, when dealing with the GCC, it's as if the populations in that part of the world do not exist. But rather, what exists are monarchies that deal with the entire region as if it's a family business. And I think we're reaching a point where if, as the EU and as the US and other countries, if we don't start to realize that there are populations there, and these populations deserve freedom and human rights and justice and equality, as does everyone else in the world, then I think we're going to be in for a very long and problematic time in the near future. If I was to very quickly speak about the situation in the Gulf, when we speak about the lack of political and civil rights in the Gulf, we're not speaking only about Bahrain. We're speaking about the UAE, we're speaking about Qatar, we're speaking about Kuwait, we're speaking about Saudi Arabia. All of the different Gulf countries lack civil political rights for their citizens. And this is very, very problematic. We have political prisoners in these countries. Some of them who are on hunger strikes. For example, Mohammed al-Bijadi, who's a human rights lawyer in Saudi Arabia, has currently been on hunger strike since the 24th, I believe. The 21st of February, sorry. And he's continuing on his hunger strike because he's been targeted for his human rights work. And of course, when I bring up these cases, this is not a unique case to that region. We're speaking about one example of hundreds of cases. He's been, like I said, targeted for his human rights work, as many people are in Saudi Arabia. When we're speaking about people who are stateless, we're speaking about people in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, who are denied any kinds of rights, and who live as if they're non-existent. They do not have birth certificates, they're not allowed an education, they're not allowed a passport. Imagine spending your entire life as if you do not exist. You are not considered a human being by your own government. I'm going to move on very quickly to the situation in Bahrain. Of course, in Bahrain, several months ago, there was a BICI commission which spoke about the human rights violations since the beginning of the uprising in Bahrain. What has happened, of course, that was a time for many human rights activists like myself. It was a time of hope, where we hoped that the Bahraini government would take this opportunity to actually create reforms, to stop the violations, and that we would see a time of change. You know, the promises that the king had made in 2001 but never actually fulfilled. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. Since the release of the report, the very same violations that we have been documenting for the past year have still been ongoing in these months up until today. We're seeing people still killed, extrajudicial killings. We're seeing still systematic torture. We're seeing systematic use of excessive force against protesters on the streets. We're seeing arbitrary arrests. We're seeing kidnappings. I mean, like I said, all of the different violations that we've been documenting for more than a year are still ongoing. Unfortunately, what the Bahraini government has been very successful in doing is engaging the international community in discussing the politics of the human rights report that was written, while they continue to commit human rights violations on a daily basis. And unfortunately, this has gone without any consequence internationally, which is, again, very, very problematic. One of the things that to us is of great concern is the continuing arms sales to the Bahraini regime. Countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like France, continue to sell arms to Bahrain today, despite the ongoing human rights violations. This comes at a time when these very same countries are criticizing Russia for selling arms to Syria. Unfortunately, these countries today are to Bahrain what Russia is to Syria. They're selling arms to an oppressive regime that is committing daily human rights violations. Like I said, we have not seen any change on the ground. There have been some reforms, but the reforms have been superficial and have not really changed the reality of the situation for people living in Bahrain. We continue to see almost on a nightly basis residential areas being tear gassed, Only since January, we've had more than 20 cases of people dying from tear gas suffocation. Many of them were inside their home when they suffocated due to the tear gas. Now, of course, I was supposed to be speaking about transitional justice. But how can we even begin to think about transitional justice when we are still in a situation where grave human rights violations are being committed on a daily basis? Now, of course, Bahrain is usually not given the same type of importance because of how small it is. Bahrain only has a population of about 700,000 people. It's about 3.5 times the size of Washington, D.C. And yet, if we were to look at it per capita, if we were to look at Bahrain in comparison to other countries, if Bahrain had the same population as Egypt, today we would have more than 11,000 people dead in Bahrain due to the uprising. That is the kind of comparison people need to hear to understand how grave the human rights violations in Bahrain are today. Of course, there has been no accountability, unfortunately. What we have seen so far are show trials where people are several policemen of the lowest ranks were put on trial. They came to trial in their police uniform, which means they haven't even been dismissed from their position or from their duty. And we found out that the same policemen who were going on trial for killing people or torturing people to death inside prison were actually previously taken to court in a military court and acquitted, and then were moved to the civilian court. We're still waiting for the government to take measures of accountability against members of the royal family who hold certain government positions, who have been, according to testimonies of torture victims, have been directly involved in torture. Two of them are the king's sons, Nasser bin Hamad al-Khalifa and Khalid bin Hamad al-Khalifa, who we have gathered testimonies at the Bahrain Center for Human Rights as having directly been involved and committed crimes of torture against people, whether on the streets during the days of the military state that was happening, or whether it was inside the prisons. Now, when we talk about international actions, of course, we've seen certain reactions to many of the countries that were involved in what is called the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for Bahrain, where we have seen special sessions about the different countries in the UN Human Rights Council. There hasn't been a single session on Bahrain. Where we have seen the Libyan team kicked out from the Human Rights Council, there's been absolutely no consequences for the Bahraini team taking part in the Human Rights Council. Where we have seen economic sanctions against Syria, for example, we have not seen the like in Bahrain. Again, I mean, these are examples, but unfortunately, we haven't even seen consistent statements condemning the human rights violations in Bahrain. And unfortunately, this comes from countries that day in and day out talk about their commitment to human rights and democracy and freedoms. And yet we are still at a point where we're seeing that geopolitical importance and economic importance today, unfortunately, is still more valuable than the lives of human beings in these countries. What we are calling on the EU to do is several things. We would like to see at least a discussion of economic sanctions against the government of Bahrain for the ongoing human rights violations. We would like to see the severing of diplomatic ties with the regime in Bahrain because of the ongoing daily human rights violations. We would like to see the freezing of accounts of members of the regime in Bahrain because of the daily human rights violations. This is at a time when Bahrain, after supposed the BICI recommendations, we have around 700 political prisoners today in Bahrain. One of them, a prominent human rights activist who is known internationally as being a human rights activist, my father, al-Khawaja, who is also a Danish citizen, has gone missing from the military hospital since yesterday. This is a man who's been on hunger strike for 77 days. Now we have no idea where he is because the Ministry of Interior and the military hospital refuse to give his family information about where he is. This is the situation in Bahrain. There is no respect for individual rights, for the rights of a prisoner of conscience or any other kind of prisoner. Finally, I would like to end with this. I think it's a bit problematic that we've seen the beautifying of the Arab Spring. Now, of course, in the beginning, it was very beautiful. Looking at a situation where people have had to pay a price of either their life or their limbs or their jobs or otherwise, or their freedom, for going out and just demanding equality and justice and freedom. And my question to you, if this is the situation of an Arab Spring, If this is the response of the international community towards an Arab Spring, then I wonder what an Arab winter will look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very clear and detailed statement. I just checked. I think we had Bahrain on our draw agenda in the last year once, and we have also in Parliament a resolution. Yesterday in the Foreign Relations Committee, in representing also the High Representative Ashton, the Foreign Minister from Denmark, Mr. Søjndal, he said that when all the foreign ministers from the EU met, I think on Monday, or over the weekend, he singled out the issue of the prisoner who is in hunger strike. Here now it's your father, and they say they try as much as they can to help him. So I think it's on a very, within the EU, I think